Okay, in our last video, we ended up with the fourth mode of major, which is Lydian. And for today's video, we're going to start with the fifth mode of major, which is called Mixolydian. So if you take a look at a Mixolydian scale, it's, similar to a major scale in that it's whole, whole, half, but then it's whole, whole, half, whole, as opposed to whole, 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 half. For the second part of it there. One major tetrachord and one minor tetrachord, a whole step apart. At the end of the day, it's like a major seventh, it's like a major scale with a flatted seventh in it, right? We can play a stacked version of this chord scale. Sounds like that. Has an avoid tone in it. There it is right there. It's the 11th. Kind of like the major scale, right? It has the 11th as well as an avoid tone. Doesn't sound quite as bad, though, for some reason. Maybe because it's a dominant chord. Remember, we said there is that exception in dominant chords that flat nine intervals tend to be okay. But usually when we talk about that, we're talking about a flat nine from the actual flat nine itself to the root of the chord. It tends to take that that pure dominant sound away if we add that 11th in there. So we generally don't do that in the Mixolydian scale. So, this chord, this 5 chord, right, from major, if we don't alter any of the notes on it, it's, functions as 5, generally functions as 5 in whatever key you're in or whatever key you're pivoting to. So for instance, if we look at the couple of voicings here, there's the first one, which I would call a plain dominant. In other words, that only has the root, third, fifth, and seventh in it. In jazz, we tend not to play just that plain sort of voicing very much. We usually at least throw something in there like that ninth, like I have in the second voicing there. We can actually voice this chord with a whole bunch of notes in it. Third version I have there, G13. So that actually has 6 different notes in it. The only one we're missing out of that scale is that C, the avoid tone, right? Now you could create a modal version, kind of like we did with Ionian. You could create a modal version by taking that 11th and moving it maybe down an octave, and then putting the other couple important notes up on the top. But once again, that doesn't sound, it's a really cool sounding chord. It's got that sort of all blues sound to it. Very cool sounding chord, but at that point I would not call that G7 anymore. I'd have to call that something else. We'd have to kind of mess around with that. It'd be like G7 with an add 11 in it. But that's definitely like a modal sort of sound of Mixolydian. Okay, so we are going to talk about a lot of different chord scales for dominant scales, though. For dominant chords. A lot of times what we will do when we encounter a dominant is we look at the function of that dominant, and then we can choose chord scales based on the function of that dominant. So if we have a chord, a 5 chord, which is functioning as 5, right? A dominant chord functioning as a 5 chord. So if this was going to C something, Mixolydian is one of the options that we have here as an improviser. Doesn't have as much color as some of the other scales that we're going to see. Okay, a couple other scales here left in major. Next one is the Aeolian scale, otherwise known as natural minor scale, right? So this would be like the relative natural minor. Not a bad sounding chord scale. Got one avoid tone in there, right? So it's a minor tetrachord and a Phrygian tetrachord. Whole step apart, kind of like a Dorian scale with a flatted 6th, but because that flat 13 here is technically an avoid tone, there's actually, melodically this scale is totally fine as long as we're not sitting on that flat 13, right? So for that reason we tend to gravitate towards Dorian when we encounter a minor 7th chord. Don't totally discount the scale. It's just we're not going to use this. We're not going to plug this scale into minor seventh chords, we are generally going to start off with Dorian, right? It just tends to give us the best colors. Okay, one more in major, and this is going to be another one that we don't really talk about too much. So the Locrian scale, or the seventh mode, sounds like this. Very, very dark sounding scale. Starts off with a half step. Actually has a flatted fifth in there. It's like a Phrygian tetrachord and a Lydian tetrachord, a half step apart, right? It's kind of like a Phrygian scale with a flatted 5, another way to look at it. The associated chord here, we'd have a B. I'm going to take this down an octave. We'd have a B half diminished with a flat 9, a natural 11, and a flat 13. So technically we would have just that one avoid tone in there. Not terrible. It's not a terrible scale, but we're going to come up with a better option for half diminished chords a little bit later when we get to melodic minor in our next video. So we'll wait for that one. We're going to kind of push this one off to the side for a second. So just as a quick wrap up here, so we're dealing with 4 pretty useful modes of major. Mode number 1, which is Ionian, right? That's just the major scale itself, right? Very useful, you know, sound on major 7th chords. The only thing is that it has 2 avoid tones in it. It has the 4th or the 11th, and then also that upper register root or URR that we want to, you know, once again, the term avoid tone doesn't mean that we just outright avoid them. It means that we have to just kind of treat them with kid gloves. Remember, harmonically, we tend to leave them out. Melodically, we tend to use them as passing tones. Dorian, which is mode number 2, that one's super useful. That's the one that we use with minor 7th chords. No avoid tones in Dorian, and that's one of the reasons we tend to gravitate towards that particular chord scale. We skip Phrygian. Phrygian's a fine scale, but not as useful as some of the other ones. Lydian, another super useful scale coming out of major. So that's kind of a more colorful version of Ionian. It's like a major scale with that sharp 11 in there. And then finally, that we talked about today, Mixolydian, which is mode number 5. Once again, that's a great scale when you have a 5 dominant 7th chord. But there are going to be some other options that we're going to talk about later. So, all right, so that wraps up our 4 useful modes of major. Look to the next video for melodic minor. See you then.